this video we'll be going over the continuation of the C# video tutorials. So in this C#.net. So we'll be talking about overloaded methods. So I think we talked a little bit about it pretty much just earlier on. We talked about methods, constructors. We might have done a few examples of just one parameter. But sometimes you need different ways to perform the same operation, so you can have a method that's overloaded. So pretty much you can take, so remember each method has a signature or a constructor, and at runtime the compiler sees which types or number of parameters that are in the or arguments that are in the constructor to match the parameters. So if you're trying to, for example, have a constructor that sets up an object with 2 fields, and then another one you could set it up with 1 field, or another one you could set it up with 3 fields. You could have all different types, so you can't have 2 constructors with 3 fields of the same type. You can't have more than one of them. So you can only have one of each. So pretty much we'll just do some examples. Okay, so for example, you could have a method or a constructor that takes, for example, 1 parameter. You could have one that takes a decimal argument and one that takes a decimal parameter and one that takes a double parameter. So you could have it just takes 1 parameter but different types. You could do that. You could do that with overloading. So you've seen them before in the docs. In different languages, they have like docs where they have built-in methods. So you've seen them before. For example, I can't think of any right now. Maybe like the parse method takes, well, I guess no, because they're named differently. I've definitely used them. I just can't remember which method, which methods are overloaded. But for example, if you have like a method, what's a built-in method? Okay, so you know how, actually no, that because a toString takes strings, so we'll look at some examples, or we could just create our own. Okay, so when a method is overloaded, it means, okay, so let's just do some notes down here. So we'll just make some multi-line comments. Once you start using multi-line comments, you won't be using the double lines anymore. Unless you just have 1 line, but okay, so overloaded methods and constructors. I think this is, yeah, so I'm not sure if we're doing constructors yet. We'll just talk about methods first. So that means that multiple methods in the same class have the same name, but use different types and pretty much number of. I'm pretty sure from Java that should be the same, and C++. I know I've seen some overloaded methods. I have the docs here anyways. It's just pretty much, I'm pretty sure it's the same thing, but pretty much because it's an object-oriented language. So for example, okay, so let's just do some notes here. We can, I'm sure I think I've already done an example of this, so this should be correct 100%, not just 80% correct, but it should be that you can have different types and you can have more than one. Pretty much you can have more than one type, but you can't have 2 overloaded methods or constructors with like 3 that take 3 string parameters, because it's not going to know. You could have one that takes 2 string parameters and one that takes an int, and you can have one that takes 3 string parameters, so that should work. If you're not sure, remember you can always just test your methods and see if it works. in the IDE, so you can just test and see if it works. Excuse me. So here, let's just do an example here. So we could pretend, if you've seen the previous video, there's a lab that we did with a bank account class. So that's in the playlist if you're interested in. So it's on my channel, csharp.net. It might be called visual csharp.net, I'm not sure. Okay, so here we had a deposit method for like some kind of app or something. Okay, so here, for example, we had public void deposit, and we said that it took a decimal amount. Or we can say that here. So this one takes a decimal amount. And then remember, we had a backing field because we set up the we created a property, so it was easy to do. We used a backing field. So we just pointed it to itself plus the amount here. Then we could have an overloaded deposit method, so we could have another one. We can go public void deposit. We could say that it takes a double this time amount rather than a decimal. Okay, so we have, for example, same idea here. We could just go with our backing field, or we could pretend that we have one. Or we could, this is pretty much an example from the last video, so we could go plus equals here. And then we could cast it to a decimal like that. And cast it to the amount. You can do that. I know you're probably not going to be that used to it if you're coming from other languages, because other languages don't have decimal. But if you're always trying to do something, you can try it and see if it works. If you get a red flag at the top, then you could just undo it, try something else. That's what I do. So here, so underscore balance, so the backing field points to the backing field plus, cast a decimal to amount, so that should work. Okay, so I don't really think we need to do a description on this. Okay, so there's a little bit of, maybe we'll just talk about it a little bit. So the first deposit method accepts a decimal argument. Okay, so we already talked about that part. So if we have, for example, so when you write a call to the deposit method, so when you call the deposit method, the compiler must determine which one of the overloaded methods you intended to call. The process of matching a method call with the correct method is known as binding. So that these are all test questions, and this is also a test question here, like a multiple choice question. Overloaded methods and constructors mean or are that multiple methods in the same class have the same name but different types of number of params. Well, that could also be a written question too. So the process of so these are university questions. So the process of matching a method call. Someone's like, yeah, I have these in high school. Your high school is advanced. We never had. I wish we had. We never had computer science in high school. I had a class on information technology, and all they had us do was use Photoshop. There was like a ghetto version of it called GIMP for Windows. Okay, so pretty much we just have. Okay, so what else do we have? Public void. Okay, yeah, so we have that. So it's called binding. So when an overloaded method is called, the compiler uses the method's name and parameter list to determine which method to bind the call. So sorry, I think there's a grammar error in my professor's notes. So when an overloaded method is called, the compiler uses the method name. So let's just write this one out actually, because it's important. Okay, so when an overloaded method, I believe our constructor is called, the compiler uses the method name and parameter list to determine which method to bind the call. So it uses its method or constructor's signature, which is like the number of parameters and type of parameters. So if you, for example, call this method and you pass it a decimal amount, if you pass it a decimal when you call the object, for example, let's say you call an object, you pass the object, or you call, okay, let's pretend we have an object here. Let's pretend it's the main method, or whatever. So if we go, let's say we go bank account, obj, or just go like this, bank account, obj, points to new bank account. We could pretend this constructor didn't take any parameters, and we could say, okay, well, we want our bank account obj dot deposit. Now we're like, okay, which method are we going to use? How is it going to know which one it's going to use? Well, if we pass it, for example, like if we pass it an M, then it's going to know it's a decimal, right? I'm pretty sure I don't use decimals that often, but that should be how you write a decimal correctly. Just tag an M on it, and you can include a decimal. I think you need to have one. You might not actually. So yeah, just go with the decimal, try if it works. If it doesn't, just take the decimal out. So I think you need the decimal there, so just add the M. So then, when you call this at runtime, the compiler is going to see, oh, well, this is a decimal, so I'm going to match it with the method that takes a decimal parameter. And I'm not going to go with this one because this takes a double parameter. So that's all you have to do. That's all it does. It's not that hard. So the compiler uses the method signature, so we already talked about that, so to distinguish it from other methods of the same name. A method signature consists of the method's name and the data type and argument kind. I believe by value. Okay, sorry, so the C# definition is a little different because of ref and out, but a method, so remember that you might have to mix and match, so if you're trying to pass one by reference as well, you just have to test and see if it works. So method signature consists of the method's name and the data type and argument kind, so such as by value, ref, or out, of the method's parameters from left to right. So I believe it's also a number of parameters. So here are the signatures of the, okay, we don't need to do that part. Okay, so now overloaded constructors. Constructors can also be overloaded, which means that a class can have more than one constructor. So we've already, I think we looked at maybe this a few times, if you're watching the playlist. So basically a class can have more than one constructor. So I've done this several times in the Java playlist. It's exactly the same. Not the Java playlist, sorry, Java data structure. So I have some really advanced codes on there for building data structures. For example, I have trees that take like 5 or more different constructors. Okay, so each version of the constructor, so the overloading constructors are the same for overloading pretty much methods. So each version of the constructor must have a different parameter list. So it could be pretty much type and number of parameters. That's what the compiler is going to be looking for. So you can't have one with the same type and number of parameters. Each constructor and method has to have its own unique signature. So it's pretty easy. So we could go back to this bank account object. For example, so we could just say that we're overloading constructors here. So we could say that we have, for example, public, we're going to reference a class to do a constructor member, so we can pretend we have this class. We can say that, well, this constructor doesn't take any parameters. We can pretend we have a backing field and set it to 0. Then we could have an overloaded constructor here, so we could go public, for example, bank account. We could pass it, I don't know, it takes a decimal balance or start balance. So we could have one overloaded like this. We could set the backing field like that, point it to, we could pretend that underscore balance is a backing field and point it to, for example, start balance, because that's what you usually do in a constructor. You point whatever you have, for example, a field of some sort or global variable backing field, and then you point it to, so I'm talking about the equal sign, so you take the equal sign, and you just point it to, for example, the starting balance, or the start balance. So it's usually, you take some field or global variable and point it to one of the parameters here, so you just kind of take it, whatever, you can pretend there's fields up here, and you just think of an arrow like that. So they just go up here and point to the parameter. And if you have another one, for example, we could go public, you could always try it. So it should be working, so you just go, for example, decimal. You can say that this one takes a decimal start balance. And then you could say, for example, that, I don't know, that this also takes a string name. We could pretend we have another backing field, so in this case we'll just go, for example, balance points to start balance. And we could say that we have, for example, a string. We could say that we have a string underscore name, like a backing field. And we could say that we go like this. So I'll change it to account name here. And we could say that the backing field underscore name points to account name. Now we have an overload here, so it knows that this one takes a decimal and a string, this one takes a decimal, and this one takes nothing. So this is a parameterless constructor, obviously, because there's no parameters in it. So you can pretend we have a main method here again. We could say that we have, for example, a bank account. We could just go account 1 points to new bank account. So this one isn't going to take any parameters. So which method would this, or which constructor would this be binded to? Which constructor would this object instantiation be binded to? Test question. Well, this one doesn't take any parameters, so we should match it with the one that takes 2 parameters, right? One that takes a decimal and one that takes a decimal start balance and a string account name. So that's the correct answer. Alright, so no, I'm just joking. So obviously it's not going to be this one, it's not going to be this one, it's going to be the one that doesn't take any parameters. So it's pretty easy. So if you create another object here, for example, bank account, account 2 points to new bank account. So we could say that this one takes, we could say that there's some kind of balance in there, and then we could say that we have, for example, it has to take a decimal, so add a decimal, and then here we'll say that it takes a, for example, so it takes an account name. We could just say this is we could just say just like person 1, like that. Actually, it takes a string, so we have to put this in a literal like that. So then that would be it like that. So which constructor would this, which constructor definition, I guess, definition would this be, would this second one down here be binded to? Well, it would be bound to this one because this one takes a decimal and a string, whereas this one just took a decimal, so it wouldn't bind this with, the compiler wouldn't bind the instantiation with this constructor, because it just takes one parameter, which is a decimal, and this one takes a string as well, so it'll go with this one. It goes to the one that's closely matched. But if you have another one like this, there should be an error, I think. So if you go, for example, public bank account, and you say that, well, this one takes a decimal end balance or something, and this one takes, for example, a string username, and you could set up the backing fields the same way. So underscore backing field points to start balance, then your underscore name would point to account name. Okay, so in this case, which one would this be bound to? Well, this one, I don't think this one's even going to work, because it's going to be like, well, you already have a constructor that takes a decimal and a string, and well, you're like, well, wait, these have different names. Well, the compiler doesn't really care about those names, it just cares about the types and number of parameters. So this one would be an error, I believe. So you can always just test, it should give you an error. If not, you could get mixed up. If it just lets it slide later on, you could get into a bug or something. So just watch out for that. Okay, so to the next part here. Okay, so default constructors, you've heard about these probably, maybe not. You actually might have not heard about them, but they're kind of a little tricky to understand. They're not too bad. But you can write a class without any constructors. Therefore, the actual language just sets it up for you, but nothing really happens. So this is called default constructors. So you can write a class without any constructors. You can write a class without any constructors. So if you write a class with no constructor, the compiler provides a default constructor. So the default constructor is a parameterless constructor. It accepts no arguments. I spelled that wrong. This is a parameterless constructor. The default constructor is a parameterless constructor, so it accepts no arguments. And it initializes the objects fields with the value 0. So I guess that would be with number types, or null for reference variables. So object reference variables, probably like strings and others like object types. Okay, so constructor. Okay, so that would make sense, right? Because an object would be set to null if you have a field, and it's just declared, then it's just going to set them up to null. It's going to set any number types to 0. So that's pretty much it for this tutorial. So in the next video we'll be going over storing class type objects in arrays and lists. I think we've done this in the notes. We're going to be continuing with it, doing some code examples and labs. So thanks for watching, guys. If you guys liked the video, you can like and subscribe to support the channel for more programming and investing tutorials. I'll see you guys in the next one, and it'll be in the C# playlist, .net on my channel. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Take care. Thanks.